Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Write it in the comments below. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to Cold Mysteries. Every week we bring you another story the world tried to bury. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Beat. Tone shifts lower. Colder. Now, let us step back in time. The year is 1859, the Oregon Territory, a place where survival meant hardship, where winters could kill the unprepared, and where superstition grew like weeds in the cracks of daily life. It was a land of pioneers, fur traders and farmers carving out lives on unforgiving soil. But in one small valley, tucked deep within a dense woodland, there stood a family no one in town wished to speak of, the Morrisons. The Morrison farm sat isolated, a half-day's walk from the nearest settlement. Its fields stretched wide, but the house itself was strange. Too large for the family who lived inside, with shuttered windows even in summer and heavy locks on every door. Travelers passing by claimed they felt watched from the tree line. Hunters whispered of hearing children's voices in the woods at night, though none ever saw the children playing in daylight. Even the local preacher, who would normally visit every farmstead to bring prayers, avoided the Morrison homestead, saying only that house holds no God. Whispers spread, and a name began to cling to the Morrison clan, the Cursed Family. At the head of this clan was Jonathan Morrison, a man said to have fought in early border conflicts back east before pushing westward to start a new life. Tall, with a piercing gaze and a voice that commanded silence, Jonathan ruled his household with iron control. His wife Margaret was rarely seen in town. His children, 6 of them pale, silent, never mingling with other families, appeared only once or twice a year during supply trips, where they stood in perfect formation behind their father like soldiers awaiting orders. Locals recalled how the children never spoke a word, never laughed, never even fidgeted. One storekeeper said, "It was as if they had been trained not to be children at all." But what unnerved the townsfolk most was what happened on the land itself. Livestock went missing, first chickens, then goats, and once even a prized cow that had been tied up securely overnight. Farmers searched the woods, finding only bloodied earth and strange wooden carvings nailed into trees. Late at night, smoke rose from the Morrison barn, thick and black, carrying an acrid stench. Some said it was just tallow burning for candle making. Others swore the smell was closer to flesh. When neighbors asked about it, Jonathan would only reply, "What we do here is for our bloodline. It is owed." No one dared press him further. In the autumn of 1859, a farmhand was hired to help with the Morrison harvest. A young man, just 17, eager for work. He was seen walking toward the property one morning, but he was never seen leaving. When the boy's father came looking, Jonathan told him the boy had run off toward California, but the father insisted his son had left his boots and belongings behind. The sheriff questioned Jonathan, but without proof there was nothing to charge him with. The Morrison farm was left alone once again, but around the settlement the whispers grew louder. If the Morrisons had nothing to hide, why did their children never smile? Why were their doors bolted even in daylight? And why did no one ever leave that house except Jonathan himself? In the years that followed, the Morrisons would become more than just an odd family on the edge of the woods. They would become a name that echoed across generations. A name tied to disappearances, to rituals, to secrets that scarred the Oregon Territory itself. And what investigators uncovered decades later inside that house would make even hardened men go pale. This is the story of the Morrison clan, America's most disturbing family secret, and it begins with blood. Every family has a beginning. For the Morrisons, it began with Jonathan, a man whose presence alone seemed to pull shadows closer. Some said he was a war veteran, though which war no one could ever confirm. Others claimed he had once been a preacher back east, until his sermons grew too dark, too blasphemous, and he was forced to leave, whatever his past. By the time he reached the Oregon Territory, Jonathan Morrison was a man who believed in one thing above all else: inheritance. Not money, not land, but blood. When Jonathan built the Morrison homestead, neighbors noted its unusual design. The ground floor was broad and square with doors bolted from the inside. Upstairs, narrow hallways twisted into dead ends. Some rooms had no windows, others had windows nailed shut. Inside, visitors recalled a house of heavy silence, where every board seemed to creak under unseen weight. One trader who delivered supplies wrote in his diary, "The walls were thick with rot, yet it was the smell that clung to me after I left. A smell I could not name nor wish to." Beneath the floorboards, there were whispers of hidden spaces, root cellars that went deeper than storage required, passages wide enough for a man to crawl through. But no one dared confirm it. Jonathan spoke little in public, but in private, he preached to his family. His children were not allowed to mingle with neighbors. His wife, Margaret, was said to be devoutly obedient, always with eyes downcast. What did he teach them? Fragments of journals discovered decades later give us a clue. In one, written in a harsh, angular hand, Jonathan scrawled, "What is owed must be paid." Our line was chosen. To deny it is to invite the curse. To accept it is to endure. To outsiders, these words may sound cryptic, but to the Morrisons, it was law. Jonathan instilled in them the belief that their family carried an ancient obligation, something dark, something older than America itself. In the winter of 1860, the Morrison farm was struck by tragedy, or so the official records say. One of the Morrison children, a boy of 9, was found at the bottom of the family's well. His body was retrieved pale, stiff, eyes wide open as though he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. Jonathan told neighbors it was an accident. The boy had been fetching water and slipped. The sheriff accepted the story. Children die, especially in the wilderness, but there were things that didn't add up. The well bucket was found resting neatly at the top, rope coiled, no sign of a fall. And when the boy was buried, those who attended noted strange symbols carved into the wooden coffin. Symbols no one in town could recognize. That night, smoke poured from the Morrison barn. The stench carried into the valley. One neighbor swore it was the smell of burning flesh. Another claimed he saw figures moving by lantern light, carrying something heavy into the barn before the flames rose. The next morning, Jonathan stood calmly outside, telling the townsfolk it was just spoiled grain they had burned. But when asked why the family did not appear at church the following Sunday, he gave a single reply. "God does not live here, only debt." By the spring of 1861, the Morrisons were marked in the minds of their neighbors. Mothers pulled their children closer when Jonathan came to town. Men avoided his gaze, but no one dared accuse him openly. Not in a territory where law was thin and survival meant keeping peace with neighbors, even those who seemed touched by darkness. And yet, more than one settler wrote in their diaries of seeing children's faces in the windows at night. Pale faces pressed against the glass, staring out into the moonlight with unblinking eyes. Faces that didn't always match the number of children the Morrisons claimed to have. This was only the beginning. The Morrisons' first tragedy was whispered about in fear, then buried under silence. But what the town did not yet realize was that this so-called accident would set a pattern. Every generation of Morrisons would carry it forward. Every generation would pay the debt. And soon, the rituals of the Morrison household would no longer stay hidden behind shuttered windows. By the mid-1860s, the Morrison homestead was no longer just a farm. It was a subject of rumor, fear, and fascination. The townsfolk whispered that the Morrisons didn't live like other families. Their routines weren't normal. Their nights were filled with sounds no family should ever make. Neighbors, though distant, described hearing strange noises carried on the wind. Rhythmic hammering like wood being struck again and again. The faint murmur of chanting. And, disturbingly, what sounded like children crying. Not the playful cries of youngsters, but long, mournful wails rising and falling in patterns too deliberate to be natural. One farmer, walking home late from town, swore he saw flickers of candlelight in the Morrison barn, shadows moving in circles. He dared not approach, but the image stayed with him. Tall figures surrounding smaller ones, all swaying to a rhythm he could not hear. When word of this spread, Jonathan Morrison dismissed it coldly. He told the sheriff, "My family prays in our own way. What you hear is none of your concern." But those who listened at night knew these were not prayers. One evening, a neighbor's boy, no older than 12, crept onto Morrison land on a dare. His friends watched from the tree line as he tiptoed across the field, reaching the barn. He slipped inside. Minutes passed. Then the boy came stumbling back, pale, shaking, eyes wide with terror. He never spoke clearly about what he saw, but fragments of his rambling chilled those who heard them. Candles, all in a circle, children holding hands, and Pa Morrison, he had something in his hands. It looked like blood. The boy never set foot near the Morrison property again, and his friends swore that even as adults, if you asked him about that night, he would only shiver and mutter. They weren't praying. The Morrisons grew increasingly withdrawn. The children stopped appearing in town altogether. Margaret Morrison, the mother, was seen only once more in the settlement, her face gaunt, eyes sunken, hands trembling as she bought flour and salt. When asked why her children were never seen, she gave a cryptic answer. They are being prepared. Prepared for what? No one dared ask. From then on, all supplies were ordered through intermediaries. Jonathan would pick up crates at the edge of town, paying in exact coin, speaking as little as possible. His children were ghosts to the community, rumors without faces. Years later, when fragments of Morrison diaries were discovered, they confirmed some of what neighbors had feared. One entry read, "The nights must be marked. The circle must hold. The debt is remembered, and the little ones must bear it." Descriptions of candles, chalk markings on wooden floors, and the use of animal blood suggested rituals of sacrifice, perhaps meant to bind or cleanse, but the most chilling detail was this. When the crying stops, the bloodline is safe for another season. This was not worship. This was transaction. The Morrisons believed they were paying a debt, one no outsider could ever understand. As the stories spread, fear grew in the nearby settlement. Parents warned their children never to wander near the Morrison woods. Hunters refused to track game past certain boundaries. Even livestock seemed to shy from the fence lines, refusing to graze too close. And yet, despite their unease, no one acted. It was the frontier, where law was thin and survival demanded coexistence. To accuse a man like Jonathan Morrison without proof could mean bloodshed, so the settlers kept their distance, and the Morrisons continued their rituals, unseen but never unheard. Looking back, these years were the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across generations. The Morrisons would isolate, perform their midnight rituals, and claim their sacrifices kept something terrible at bay. But what was this debt they claimed to pay? Why did every generation of Morrison children bear its weight? The answers would only begin to surface when bodies began to vanish, and neighbors started to suspect the Morrisons were no longer sacrificing animals alone. By the late 1860s, the whispers surrounding the Morrisons had grown darker. What began as rumors of strange noises and midnight rituals soon escalated into something no one could ignore. People began to vanish. The Oregon Trail was still alive, with wagons and travelers moving westward. Stragglers often cut across local valleys for shelter or food. Most farms welcomed them for a fee, but those who passed near the Morrison homestead were not always seen again. 2 hunters disappeared first, then a peddler carrying bolts of cloth never returned from his journey. In each case, the last known sighting placed them near Morrison land. One witness recalled seeing the peddler's cart, broken by the roadside, horses gone, belongings scattered, but no body. Just the Morrison patriarch walking calmly back toward his home. When questioned later, Jonathan claimed he had never seen the man, but the settlers began to keep count. 5 people vanished within 3 years, all near the same property. Coincidence or something more deliberate? During one search, the sheriff and several townsfolk combed the woods bordering the Morrison farm. They found no graves, no blood, no evidence of murder. What they did find were carvings, symbols etched deep into the bark of old oaks, some resembling circles within circles, others more like crude human figures bent in unnatural positions. No one recognized them, but the sheriff, unnerved, ordered the carvings cut away. The next day, according to one farmer's diary, thick smoke rose again from the Morrison barn. By morning, the carvings were replaced, new ones fresher, as though mocking the sheriff's attempt to erase them. Then came the event that shook even those who defended the Morrisons. In 1871, another Morrison child, a girl of just 7, was found dead. This time, floating in the well, her body stiff, eyes staring toward the sky. The family buried her quickly, refusing the presence of neighbors or clergy. But one settler who saw the coffin swore there were symbols carved once again into the wood. The death was ruled accidental, a tragic drowning. But whispers spread that this was no accident, that the Morrisons had offered their own blood to feed whatever curse they believed in. By this time, fear had turned into anger. A group of men gathered in the tavern, debating whether to confront Jonathan Morrison directly. But courage faltered. The frontier was a lawless place, and few wished to start a feud with a family that seemed touched by something otherworldly. One preacher urged caution, saying, "If you meddle in the affairs of a cursed bloodline, you risk carrying their debt upon yourself." And so once again, silence won over action. The Morrisons were left alone, though no one trusted them. The sheriff himself tried once more. He rode to the farm demanding answers. According to his later notes, Jonathan received him calmly, even inviting him inside. The sheriff declined. He said the smell inside was unbearable, a mix of iron and rot. Jonathan gave no denial. Instead, he stared at the sheriff and said, "The land remembers. The blood must be paid. Leave us to our work and you will be left in peace." The sheriff never returned. Nor did he mention the Morrisons again in his reports. But privately, he confessed to his wife, "There are things I cannot fight with law, only with God." And God is not in that house. By now, the Morrisons were no longer merely feared. They were hated, avoided, isolated. But inside their shuttered home, they were preparing the next generation. Children raised not to play, not to dream, but to inherit the rituals their father began. And soon, their behavior would terrify the town even more than the patriarch himself. By the 1870s, the Morrison children had grown into young adults. But unlike other families, they did not bring relief or hope to the settlement. Instead, they carried forward the shadows their father had planted, displaying behaviors so chilling that even hardened frontier folk crossed the road to avoid them. One of the Morrison sons, Samuel, was often seen carrying glass jars. At first, townsfolk thought he collected insects, a harmless pastime. But one storekeeper delivering supplies to the farm claimed he glimpsed inside one jar. It wasn't bugs, it was bones. Tiny bones carefully labeled with scraps of paper, chickens, rabbits, and one jar, smaller than the rest, simply marked with a date. When asked about it, Samuel smiled and said, "Pa says the bones remember." That storekeeper never went back. Another child, Ruth Morrison, showed her curse through drawings. She filled scraps of paper and bits of wood with charcoal sketches, graves, coffins and figures with hollow eyes. One day, she handed her school teacher a drawing of the teacher herself, eyes crossed out, hands bound. The teacher resigned that same week, telling others, "That girl doesn't draw from imagination. She draws what she sees coming." Not all the Morrison children remained. In 1874, Eliza, one of the daughters, vanished into the woods at just 14. Her family offered no explanation. When neighbors asked, Jonathan simply said, "She is where she needs to be." Search parties combed the forest. No body was ever found. Some believed she ran away. Others whispered she had been offered up, like the drowned child before her, to satisfy the family's debt. And from that day forward, whenever a girl went missing in the territory, people asked first, did the Morrisons take her? The Morrison clan rarely brought their children into town. But when they did, the silence was more unsettling than noise. The children stood perfectly still, eyes forward, never speaking, never smiling. One merchant recalled how a Morrison boy placed his hand on a jar of honey in the store. When the merchant said, "That'll be 2 cents," the boy simply stared until his father appeared and paid without a word. The merchant later said it was like he didn't understand speech, or worse, he understood too much. By this time, Townsfolk began calling them the Marked Ones. Every family in the valley told their children, never play near Morrison land, never speak to a Morrison child, and never, under any circumstance, accept a gift from them. There were whispers that the children bore strange marks on their skin, birthmarks shaped like circles, appearing in the same place on each generation. No one could prove it, but the rumor was strong enough that even the boldest settlers kept away. And so, the Morrisons grew deeper into isolation. They did not need the town. They had their rituals. They had their doctrine. And their children were becoming living proof of it. Jonathan Morrison lived long enough to see his children grow into adulthood, but rather than loosening his grip, he tightened it. According to fragments of his journals, discovered later in the ruins of the house, he wrote, "They must be kept. They must not wander. The blood must not be thinned. We are chosen to bear what others cannot." This was not merely a family. It was a cult of blood, locked inside one home, generation after generation. But even Jonathan could not hold them forever. Outside forces, the church, the law, the doctors, would soon intervene. And when outsiders set foot inside the Morrison home, they would leave changed. Some broken, some silent, and some would swear that the house itself was alive. By the 1880s, the Morrison name had become more than a rumor. It was a warning, a stain on the valley. But for some, that stain was too dangerous to leave unchecked. Doctors, priests, and investigators, outsiders not yet consumed by fear, stepped forward to confront the Morrison clan. What they saw inside that home would follow them for the rest of their lives. In 1881, a physician from Portland was summoned after one of the Morrison boys reportedly fell ill. Dr. Isaac Fletcher arrived at the homestead with his bag of instruments. According to his own notes, preserved in a medical journal, the boy showed no signs of disease, but rather malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and deep scars across his back. When Fletcher asked how the boy received them, Jonathan Morrison interrupted sharply. "He carries what we all must carry. Do not question it." The doctor later wrote, "The child's eyes were unlike any I had seen, hollow, yet fixed on me with an intensity I cannot name. He whispered something under his breath that I could not understand. I fled before I could ask again. Fletcher never returned." In lectures years later, he would describe the case only as proof that cruelty can masquerade as inheritance. 2 years later, in 1883, a Catholic priest, Father Matthew O'Rourke, came to the valley. Disturbed by stories of the Morrisons' rituals, he sought to bring them back into the church. He was invited into the home. His written testimony, later found in church archives, describes a household steeped in silence and ritual. The air inside was heavy with ash. The children sat in rows, unblinking, lips moving silently. When I asked what they were saying, the mother answered, "They are repeating what is owed." I felt then that I was not among the living, but in a tomb. Father O'Rourke attempted a blessing, sprinkling holy water in the main room. The children began to scream, not in pain, but in perfect unison, as though rehearsed. Their voices rose so high the priest dropped the vial and fled. He returned to town, white-faced, insisting, "That house is consecrated to something older than the church. I cannot save them." In 1887, following more disappearances near the Morrison property, 2 deputies were sent to search the homestead. Their official report was brief, claiming they found no wrongdoing. But one deputy, years later, confessed on his deathbed. He claimed they entered a locked barn and found crude shackles bolted to the floor. Ashes still smoldered in a furnace, filling the air with a smell of burnt hair. And in the corner, neatly stacked, were children's shoes, too many for one family to explain. When they confronted Jonathan, he simply said, "The land remembers. You would do well to forget." The deputies left without filing charges. One never spoke of it again. The other drank himself into ruin. A handful of letters from travelers who stayed briefly at the Morrison farm also survive. One described waking in the night to the sound of scratching inside the walls. Another wrote of seeing a child standing outside her window, staring into the dark, unmoving for hours. But perhaps the most chilling came from a schoolteacher who lodged there while passing through. She wrote to her sister, "They are not children in that house. They are rehearsals of something else. And I fear if I stay another night, I will not leave at all." She left the next morning and never returned to Oregon. These were the outsiders, the ones who tried to intervene, to diagnose, to save, but each left broken, frightened, or silent. And yet the Morrison line endured. Because when Jonathan Morrison finally passed, the curse did not die with him.
It spread into the third generation.
And what those children did would make the first two look tame. When Jonathan Morrison finally died, the settlement dared to hope that the nightmare would end. But the truth was more terrible than anyone expected. His children, raised in silence, bound by his doctrine, passed everything they had learned to their own offspring. The curse did not weaken, it grew stronger. The Morrison homestead was inherited by the eldest surviving son, Samuel, the boy once known for his jars of bones. Now a man in his 30s, Samuel kept the house shuttered, the rituals intact. Neighbors said he rarely spoke. When he did, his words were chilling. Pa said the debt doesn't die, it doubles. Under his control, the next generation of Morrison children was raised as prisoners more than family. They were seen only in glimpses, thin, pale, always moving in groups.
None were ever allowed to play outside. None attended school. And when Samuel's wife was asked why the children never came to town,
she answered simply, "They are being made ready." In 1890, hunters reported hearing laughter echoing from the Morrison woods late at night. Not the laughter of play, but shrill, overlapping voices all at once, as though rehearsed. When they followed the sound, they saw the farmhouse dark, every window shuttered, yet the laughter continued until it ended in sudden silence. One hunter swore he heard a single phrase whispered across the trees. "Ode, ode, ode." He never hunted near the Morrison land again. Not long after, strange things began to happen in the Valley Cemetery. Graves were found disturbed, coffins cracked open. At first, settlers blamed grave robbers, but soon they noticed a pattern. Only the graves of children had been touched. When suspicion turned to the Morrisons, Samuel denied it with his usual calm. "The dead are not gone. They are part of what we carry," he said. Then he smiled, a thin, eerie smile that unsettled even hardened men. No charges were ever filed, but families began burying their loved ones in secret, far from Morrison land. In 1893, a chilling piece of evidence emerged, a diary belonging to one of Samuel's sons, discovered years later after the homestead burned. The boy's handwriting, uneven but legible, revealed disturbing details. "They tell us to sleep in shifts.
They say the voices are clearer at night.
I dream of faces I have not seen, but they whisper my name. Sometimes Pa says I must give blood, so the voices do not grow louder.
I don't like it.
But if I refuse, they say the land itself will take me." This was not imagination. This was indoctrination, passed seamlessly from one generation to the next. By the 1890s, the settlement had changed. Railroads arrived, towns grew, and new families moved in. But the old families still whispered about the Morrisons. The curse was not fading. It was adapting. New settlers reported seeing pale children watching from the tree line. One farmer swore he awoke to find small handprints pressed against his windows, too small to belong to any of his own children. And when he asked his neighbors if they had seen anything, they simply shook their heads. That's the Morrisons. Don't look too long and don't ask twice. 3 generations. 3 cycles of silence, ritual, and fear. The first had drowned children in wells. The second had sketched death and vanished into woods. And now the third was laughing at night, disturbing graves, and keeping diaries of whispered commands. This was no longer just a family secret. It was a living curse fed by blood, repeated across time like scripture, and soon the homestead itself would give up its secrets. Because when fire finally touched the Morrison house, investigators would uncover horrors that proved the curse was more than whispers. It was written in the walls. For decades, the Morrison farm stood silent and untouched. Locals whispered, avoided, and feared it. But in 1901, fire finally forced open its secrets. The blaze, believed to have started in the barn, spread quickly to the main house. By the time neighbors arrived, much of the upper floor had collapsed. But the lower rooms, the ones hidden away, were laid bare, and what investigators found inside confirmed the worst of the valley's fears. Firefighters and townsfolk worked to douse the flames. As smoke cleared, they stepped into rooms no outsider had ever seen. The house's interior was a maze. Narrow corridors led to dead ends. Doors opened into walls. One staircase rose into nothing. It was as if the house had been designed not for comfort, but for confusion. In the cellar, they found crawl spaces barely wide enough for a child, leading into chambers carved out beneath the earth. These were not cellars for food or storage. They were cells. In one underground room, iron rings were bolted into the floor. Chains still hung from them, rusted but clearly used. Beside them, piles of straw were found, flattened as though bodies had once lain upon them. The smell of mold and rot lingered in the air. One deputy who entered the space vomited and refused to go back inside. He later told a neighbor those weren't stalls for animals. They were for people. Worse still was what stood at the far end of the cellar. A large furnace, half collapsed from the fire, but still intact enough to reveal its purpose. Ash clung to the bricks in thick layers. When sifted, it revealed fragments, burnt bone, some clearly animal, but others unmistakably human. A physician present at the scene identified at least 3 skull fragments too small to belong to adults. No official report ever confirmed this publicly, but word spread quickly through the valley. The Morrisons had not merely practiced strange rituals, they had destroyed evidence in fire. In a second chamber, rescuers found something even more chilling. Dozens of shoes stacked neatly in a corner. Small shoes, child-sized, some worn, some new, some with laces still tied. No explanation was offered.
None could be. But families in the valley whispered about their own lost children, those who had vanished on the trail.
Or near the woods, or while wandering too close to Morrison land. The shoes were silent proof, but proof no one dared carry into a courtroom on the walls of the cellar. Blackened by smoke, strange carvings were revealed. Circles intersecting, crude stick figures with arms raised, shapes resembling wells, spirals, and suns with jagged rays. Some claimed the symbols were old, Celtic, Norse, pagan. Others said they were gibberish. But one word appeared again and again, scratched into wood, into stone, even into the backs of doors. Ode. The debt. The same word neighbors had heard whispered in the night. The word that defined the Morrison curse. Strangely, official records of the fire are sparse. A brief mention in the county ledger notes structural instability and fire damage. No mention of shackles, no mention of bones, no mention of shoes. Locals believed the truth was suppressed, buried to protect the settlement's reputation, or perhaps out of fear that acknowledging the Morrison horrors would give them power. But the people of the valley did not forget. Diaries, letters, and whispered stories preserved what the official papers erased. The Morrison homestead was never rebuilt. Its ruins stood blackened for decades until finally the land was sold, parceled, and passed down. But the curse did not end with the fire, because the survivors of the Morrison line, the children who lived through the blaze, carried their families' doctrine forward. And in the years that followed, new graves, new testimonies, and new horrors would surface. The debt was never paid. It was only inherited. The fire of 1901 revealed horrors within the Morrison home, but even then the truth was only partially spoken. Officials recorded the fire, the collapse, and the property's decay. But what the people of the valley remembered were the details the ledgers left out. Because long after the ashes cooled, testimonies began to surface, testimonies that painted the Morrison curse in blood and silence. Several members of the Morrison clan survived the fire. A few moved away, settling in nearby towns under different names. Most lived in obscurity, but fragments of their words survived, in diaries, in whispered confessions, in testimony preserved by family descendants. One daughter, known only as Mary, reportedly told her husband on her wedding night, "You will never understand what I was made to do, what I was told to carry. If I have children, I will not touch them.
I will not hold them.
It is safer that way." Another Morrison boy, sent to live with distant relatives, was said to have nightmares well into adulthood. He screamed at night of wells, of locked doors,
of faces that do not belong. He died young, and his relatives burned his writings,
claiming they were too disturbing to keep. In 1922, decades after the fire, new owners of the land attempted to clear part of the old Morrison property for farming. While ploughing near the edge of the woods, their horse stumbled into a shallow depression. Beneath the soil lay bones, small bones, too many to be from a single body. Further digging revealed at least 6 unmarked graves. Some were shallow, others little more than pits covered with stones. Most contained children. None matched the names in census records. The graves were hastily reburied, the land consecrated by a priest, but rumors spread fast. Families who had lost children on the trail began to wonder, had their little ones wandered too close to the Morrison farm? Scattered among the ruins, and later in the possession of collectors, were fragments of Morrison diaries. Many were destroyed by fire, but a handful survived. One passage attributed to Samuel Morrison read, "The children learn quickly. They must not forget the word. If they forget, the debt falls to us all. Better to carve it into their skin than to risk silence." Another, from an unnamed Morrison woman, perhaps Margaret or one of her daughters, was even more chilling. "I begged him to stop. I begged him to let the children sleep. But he said the voices grow louder if they rest. He said they must rehearse. He said the debt demands their voices, their blood, their silence, if authentic." These passages confirmed what neighbors had long suspected. The Morrison rituals were not only belief, but indoctrination passed from parent to child as duty, as curse. Yet strangely, none of this ever appeared in official county records. The sheriff's ledgers were blank after the fire. Court records contained only mentions of property sales, inheritance disputes, and vague references to disorder. Some historians argue this was deliberate suppression, that officials feared panic or ridicule, or perhaps lawsuits from families who might demand answers about their missing children. Others believe something darker, that the Morrisons had allies in positions of power, people who understood their rituals or even shared them. Whatever the reason, the Morrison horrors were buried in silence, left to smolder like embers under ash, but silence does not erase memory. The Morrison name became legend, a ghost story told around firesides. Parents warned their children never to wander into those woods. Even decades later, travelers reported unease when passing near the ruins. Some swore they heard whispers in the wind. Others claimed to see pale figures moving between trees, children with hollow eyes, standing in the moonlight and vanishing when approached. And always, one word echoed, scratched into diaries, carved into wood, whispered in nightmares, "Ode." The Morrison clan may have scattered, their house burned, their land divided, but their curse did not die, because the land itself seemed to carry it, and to this day, locals still say, if you stand near the ruins at night, you will hear the Morrison children calling. And if you answer, you may never leave. Some stories die when the people who lived them are gone.
Others outlive their families, their homes, even their graves. The Morrison story is one of those.
Because though their house burned, their land sold and their bloodlines scattered, the curse never truly left Oregon. The Morrison homestead was never rebuilt after the fire of 1901. Its blackened timbers rotted in the rain, its cellar filled with weeds, its land divided and sold. Today, a modest farmhouse and a government building stand where the Morrison clan once lived, but locals say that if you walk the property after sundown, you'll feel the air grow heavy, as though something unseen still breathes beneath the soil. Hikers report sudden chills, strange knocking sounds beneath their feet, and the overwhelming smell of smoke, even when no fire burns nearby. One man, visiting in the 1970s, claimed he heard children's laughter in the wind, but when he turned, there was no one, just the outline of the old foundation, barely visible in the moonlight. In the valley towns, the Morrisons became a kind of forbidden tale.
A warning told to children, stay away from the woods after dark, mothers would say.
Or the Morrison children will find you. Some said if you listened closely on winter nights, you could hear voices chanting from the direction of the old farm. Others swore they saw pale faces at the windows of houses long abandoned, and always the same phrase whispered in those stories: ode, ode, ode. Generations grew up with that word, carrying the echo of the Morrison debt without even knowing its meaning. In the late 20th century, paranormal investigators began exploring the ruins. Several reported equipment failures, batteries drained, cameras refusing to work. Others recorded faint voices on audio devices, repeating words too garbled to understand. But one phrase was clear enough to send shivers down spines. On 3 separate recordings in 3 different years, a faint child's voice whispered the same thing: "We are still here." Visitors also describe objects moving on their own, sudden nausea, and even scratches appearing on their skin. A few researchers left their projects unfinished, refusing to speak of what they experienced. One, in an interview decades later, said only, "The Morrisons weren't a family,
They were a disease.
and the land still carries it." Historians still debate what the Morrison legacy truly was. Were they simply a family driven mad by isolation, superstition, and cruelty? Or did they inherit something darker? An idea, a ritual, perhaps even a belief so strong it became real? The truth may never be known, but what makes the Morrison story unforgettable is not just the deaths, or the rituals, or the hidden rooms. It's the idea that evil can be taught like a language, passed like an heirloom, repeated until it becomes tradition. A curse does not need spirits or demons to survive. Sometimes all it needs is a family willing to carry it forward. So the Morrison clan lives on, not in blood, but in memory. Their story is etched into the soil of Oregon, carried in the whispers of wind through the valley, in the diaries, the graves, the shoes left behind, and perhaps in the children's voices some still claim to hear. The question we are left with is not whether the Morrison curse was real. The question is whether curses like theirs can ever truly die. Because if belief is strong enough, if rituals are repeated long enough, maybe the debt is never paid. Maybe it waits, generation after generation, until someone else is willing to inherit it. If this story has unsettled you, tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And if you want more tales of forgotten families, disturbing secrets, and curses that history tried to erase, subscribe to Cold Mysteries. Every week, we open another locked door.
And remember,
Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.